sukkah, but we can't this year, so we're having 5 guests in our virtual sukkah. And tonight we are lucky to have Dr. George Berci here with us as our sukkah guest. Welcome, George.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So, George, where are you from?
I'm originally from Hungary, born in a smaller city called Szeged, which is near the Yugoslav border. It didn't have more than 400,000 inhabitants in my time, but had a famous university with a Nobel Prize winner who got the Nobel Prize because he invented vitamin C. It was a very Catholic archbishop city, and again, border town. I was born there. My father was a musician. My grandfather was a conductor and a musician. We had a large family. My grandmother had a sister who was born with a crippled leg and was operated. She was with us. And this was our family. As far as I know from my historical data, I think I was approximately age 3. My father was, by coincidence, a so-called concert timpanist. And they are very rare specialists. And my grandfather was also a French hornist. To cut the story short, how they get hold of the Vienna Symphony Orchestra, I don't know. They got a job there. Owing to the fact that we had a relatively difficult financial situation, and Vienna was a musical center. That time, it's even today. They moved me there, and I worked in the job and in the orchestra, the symphony orchestra.
As a timpanist, your father?
As a timpanist, a concert. This is the guy who sits in the back and plays with a tympanon.
And did your family own timpani drums?
No, no. My father, very early of my stage, got an offer from India to help to establish, we're talking about 25 or 30, to help to establish the Bombay Symphony Orchestra. He moved to India. And my parents later on got divorced. Therefore, being in Vienna, I had to learn music. And I think it was age 3 or 4. The easiest way for my grandfather was to get me a small fiddle violin. And he worked with me every single afternoon. I already loved soccer. I had to quit soccer and I played the fiddle. It seems to me that I was pretty good because a year or 2 later, the concertmaster of the Vienna Symphony took me as a little pupil. We didn't have money and I didn't charge. And I became extremely well trained according to the age. And the family worked under a relatively difficult financial situation. My mother had an uncle who was an engineer who helped us. He He became the director of Electrolux in Austria. But what's happened, and I didn't notice this first, that Hitler started very early to infiltrate Austria from a variety of reasons. One, they spoke the same language, which is a very important factor. Number two, I don't know whether folks know, Hitler was born in Austria, in the city of Linz. Therefore, these factors played a tremendous uh, big weight uh, that it was easy for him slowly to infiltrate the country. There was another factor. Austria is Roman Catholic. And we had uh, the archbishop, which really controlled all the villages, churches, and so forth. Therefore, when the guys gave talk on Sundays, they got the summary from Vienna. Well, it became very obvious that he will move in, Hitler, and we left, therefore, Austria and moved back to Hungary. I arrived there. I missed my matriculation in Austria, therefore, when I arrived, this was the first I tried to get in to do a high school for the last year to get my paperwork. And I spoke very poorly Hungarian, of course, but the major issue is I was Jewish. And that time there was already an enormous right-wing move in Hungary. I couldn't get through. I couldn't get in to any state high school. I was, to a certain extent, lucky that there was a Jewish high school in Budapest, was a private one. Needless to say, I had to give up my playing the fiddle, the violin, and the problem to get into a private school is the fees were extremely high. We couldn't afford it. Therefore, I went to garages and washed cars in my last 2 years on the weekend. And this is how I supported my 2 years in the Jewish high school, and I matriculated there in 1939. It was obvious in Hungary too that there is a right shift because when I matriculated, I did very well and I thought I perhaps can get in to the university, but they call it in a too Latin word, numerus clausus, which means restricted entry. And it became numerus nullus zero for Jews. But I was able to get into a mechanical engineering school. And I worked, did a 1 year, and then I worked as a mechanical engineer for almost 3 years, which was a tremendous help for me in my later stage that I got some basic mechanical ideas and some engineering. We lived under difficult circumstances. My uncle got married, a Jewish girl, and you can interrupt me if it's boring or you want to get something out. Okay?
Okay, got it. Thank you.
The Germans decided that they need urgently Hungarian Jewish boys to form a labor camp.
And how old were you at this point?
In 42, I was 20, when we have to divide it from 14. and then I tell you in a moment.
In 1942, 21.
1942, and I was born in 21. Yeah, I was 21 years old.
And it's at that point that you were conscripted to work at a Nazi labor camp?
Yeah, and what I did, I pulled together boys from age 21 to 26, and they were divided into geographical area. We became had a yellow armband, and we were taken to Romania. The Germans, even that time, thought that they needed protective wall or certain areas rebuilt in case the Russian would
And then
army.
what about your parents and siblings? I mean, you were conscripted, but were they taken away? Did they have to go to camps? What was it
Well,
only
I
you or
didn't
your
hear
parents?
from them. Yes, we had a large family. What do you mean a large? I have uncles, etc. It was around 14. Of course, I lost any contact with my family, and out of these 14, we survived that time three, including myself.
Wow.
Um, my mother survived. Now, the labor camp was in Romania, in the mountains,
Hmm.
and it was very difficult. We were there in groups of 250. It's like a military battalions, and we had to dig out a so-called protective area. The winter times was extremely difficult because
Wow.
it's mountain, snow. And we didn't lived in hotels. To tell you the truth, it was some beton buildings,
Mm.
bloody cold. Um, uh, we had, of course, a right-wing army who looked after us, and there were significant punishments.
Mm.
Number one, if somebody was very sick, was sent to a hospital, we never saw it. We
Mm.
had a couple of people who were born youngsters with some diseases, and if they got some episodes, for instance, the wintertime, they don't allow us to help them. They took these kids, the army put it out in the snow. We couldn't uh, uh, approach them or help them, and we saw many youngsters dying there.
And
Therefore,
at that point, did you think you were going to escape? You know, did you think you were going to make it through to see the end of that war?
all right, well, in 1944, suddenly, from one day to another, we was put on a train to get to Germany, to take us to Germany. Nobody knows that the Russians broke through the German army, and we had to go to Hungary. And in Budapest, we stopped, and I never heard sirens. Everybody disappeared, including our army guys,
Hmm.
because the American Air Force bombed Budapest. And suddenly we were there without anybody. Therefore, this is how I escaped.
Hmm.
Uh, the other story, I found my mother in a Yellow Star home. This was in 1944, I think June or July. And to cut the story short, I looked for jobs, and by coincidence, I met somebody who has also a foreign accent. To cut the story short, through him, he worked on the Swiss consulate. He introduced me. Um, I got papers, of course, foreign papers, and my duty was to deliver this to certain groups of Jews who were hiding in Budapest. And there were many other areas. I got very good papers that I'm a German engineer working in Budapest. And I worked there for 7 months on the ground. I was able to save my mother when the Russian occupied the capital city. Um, and here we are. I mean, this was the situation. There was no food, no water, no electricity. Therefore, my mother recommended that we're going back to the city where I was born in the south because the Russian occupied this area of Hungary 6 months earlier. And they were already somehow under control. Long story, which you see in the book, why we were able to move back to Szeged. The university opened up there, and I had no problem.
Wait, the university in Szeged?
In Szeged, yeah.
What was it like to come back home? I mean, I'm sure a lot of people were gone, and after the war, after being gone for so many years, after working in that labor
We
camp.
didn't found anybody. I hardly remember did we found a Jew. There was a magnificent Jewish synagogue, which was completely empty. And I think I was the only one Jew that time. Was around 100 first year medical student. A few Jews came back later, a year later. And this is where I started my medical school.
And that was in Szeged, in the university there.
Yeah, I was very lucky to the extent that I had this engineering background that they used me. I got a little jobs in the lab to prepare for the students, to help to repair certain tools, etc. Made a little pocket money. But I studied medicine, and um, I completed my study in 1950. I was also very lucky that I helped a couple of assistants in the surgical area with my background. Therefore, I got a job at the surgical university, surgical clinic, the surgical department. In the morning hours, I went to my object to listen to them. In the evening, I was very lucky to get a bed in the hospital. I was able to sleep. And interestingly enough, that time anesthesia was performed by Roman Catholic nurses, by nurses. And they trained me. Therefore, I did in nighttime the emergency anesthesia, the narcotic area. I was very happy to learn. And I completed my study in 1950. Having some influence in surgery, people know me, I know people. I got a job as a resident.
This is still in Szeged, or
1951
in Szeged?
in Szeged. I finished my residency in 1950. There's a long story. You see it in the book. I lost my job because, interestingly enough, being Jewish, have no idea what's going on politically. I know Hitlerism when I heard that the Russians are coming in, I thought, oh my God, here we have Leninism, a stateless society. We will be free being a Jews. And then Leninism came in form of Stalin,
Mhm.
and took me approximately 2 years to find out what means Stalinism.
And how
And
did you find out?
I mean,
How did you find out what it meant?
well, very interestingly, because I found out that there are no differences in a totalitarian state, whether it's a German Hitlerism or it's a Stalinism. People disappeared at night time.
Mm.
The party secretary was the director. In the university department, the professor couldn't appoint anybody without the signature of the secretary.
Hmm.
In other words, I became extremely disappointed having a democratic background of thinking. Um, and I was very lucky. I did something interesting, um, experiment with a surgeon, published it, and suddenly I became uh, invited to the capital city. Uh, every city in the occupied countries from Russia has had a certain um, consultant who was really the minister from Russia, including the health.
Mm.
I hadn't a clue that the guy who invited me to talk about my uh, published experience and preserved arteries, I did not know that he is the Russian guy in health who directs. And we had a little chat. I told him that I have problems with my job. And in 3 days, I got a job in the capital city to continue my work, my experimental work.
That was in Budapest?
Was in Budapest. This was previously the Jewish hospital.
Hmm. Oh, so there was still so there was a Jewish hospital in Budapest.
Yeah, it was, and then it changed, of course, to a state hospital.
Oh, okay. And so by the time you were working there, it was a state hospital.
State, yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, there were very few Jews. In Hungary, we had 600,000 Jews. Out of the 600,000, perhaps 50,000 survived,
Mm.
to get some ideas about the figures.
Did people know you were Jewish at the hospital?
There were perhaps one or two, very few,
Mm.
very
And
few.
the ones who did, were they surprised? Did they treat you any differently?
Yes. Uh, I Unfortunately, I always had a big mouth, and therefore we had, of course, secretaries of the parties in the hospital. There's no
Mhm.
question. The prof couldn't sign the paper without them. And we had so-called spies. If you are involved in a surgery, which is say 2 hours on the end, we are a little bit tired, and we are at the end. We speak about politics, and we criticize. Okay. I hadn't a clue that there was somebody there who put my remarks on to the secretary,
Mm.
that they have a folder about my name there. Yeah. Again, there was not a heck of a difference between a terroristic and terroristic society.
Mhm.
Um, I was again lucky that my studies in experimental surgery, I had very good results. Therefore, this helped me to overcome. And um, as you know, we had a revolution. I was a young resident, and it was uh, we had around 220,000 people in form of the parliament, and the political police from around the top of the houses started to shoot with machine guns. We have several thousand deaths. I don't know how many thousand people were gunshot, and our department, which was a relatively medium size, we had 110 surgical beds. We got 100 gunshots within 1 hour.
Oh my gosh.
And they bled. We had no idea what to do. They were on the corridor yelling, actually. Therefore, we started to operate on those, and we caught. It was a terrible episode in my life, having already a surgical background to see people dying and you can't help. We run out in hours about IV solutions, medication, you name it. And as you know, the Hungarian Revolution, which was a 2 weeks old episode, was stopped by the Russians. The army moved in, and then I determined that I'm leaving the country. Therefore, we escaped to Australia.
Mm.
Hadn't a clue about the lingo, and on the boat. It was in January 1956. The Suez Canal, as you know, the geography, you can make a shortcut there,
Mhm.
was bombed by the British Air Force because there was a problem with Egypt.
Mhm.
Therefore, this little boat where we had 800 uh, Hungarian refugees has to go through around Africa in wintertime.
Hmm.
And it took us 3 weeks to get to Australia. It was
Wow.
a terrible time, terrible. Yeah.
Hmm.
We stopped in Dakar and Cape Town. It's very interesting. The Jewish organization in Cape Town find out, I don't know, that 2 dozens of Jews were, or dozens of Jews were on the boat that treated us very nicely. And then we arrived to Australia. And no language, no money. We were put in a camp. I had a joke that I have camping experience. Uh, but then my mother, I had a stepfather, um, uh, I couldn't stand there, I mean, doing nothing. And therefore, I stopped a truck on the freeway, not speaking English. I had a piece of paper. I made my own head. I was in between Melbourne and Sydney.
Mhm.
I don't know still why I selected Sydney on the paper, showed the driver, and he asked me to step in.
Mhm.
It was around 300 miles from Melbourne.
Mhm.
And we arrived to Melbourne, and he asked me to leave. He talked to me. I had no idea or clue what he's talking.
Mhm.
And this is how I arrived to Melbourne. And being there in the afternoon, not a clue where he put me down. By coincidence, it was a suburb where a lot of Jews were,
Hmm.
called St. Kilda. And I heard somebody talking Hungarian on the phone. Pure coincidence.
Hmm.
This is how I escaped. He took me in, to cut the story short. They helped me, took me to the university um, because I had some background. I got a job as a lab tech to clean the instrument. And because there was another aspect which I have forgotten to mention, which was helpful, is that when we escaped to Vienna to continue to Australia, the Austrian Medical Association invited the Hungarian doctors, approximately 600 or 800. We had to fill out a lot of paperwork and question. And I did not know that the Rockefeller Fellowship Association was there.
Hmm.
And because we had to answer questions what we did, what we published, or did we do something. Uh, 6 people were selected by the Rockefeller Fellowship to get a grant.
Hmm.
I was very fortunate, I was one. And with this paper in my pocket, I went to Australia. And when they showed it without speaking, the first one, they put me in the evening, every evening, to a teaching class in the school to everywhere. There were a lot of immigrants there for the teaching, taught English. And I got a job as a lab tech at the university. And I got 6 months to learn the lingo.
Hmm.
That time, I had the opportunity to learn 100 words per night.
Wow. That's so you learned a whole language in six
Yeah,
months.
well, I mumbled, but I was somehow, after 6 months, was able
Hmm.
to communicate and I listen. And, well, I was young,
Right.
you know, and this is how I became, uh, in the Department of Surgery, the first bloody foreigner and the first bloody Jew in Melbourne. They were extremely nice. I never ever felt any anti Semitism.
Hmm.
The prof was from Scotland.
Wow.
There's a little story that in Australia, that time is upside down. Christmas time is the summertime because we are near the
Hmm.
equator. And the British custom is they have a big dinner party, Christmas dinner party, in tuxedo. And I was called in by the prof, and the prof told me, listen, you are now in the department, you are most welcome. Do you have a tuxedo? I even didn't know what the word is. Haven't a clue, is this a pajama or whatnot? I said, well, I will rent something. The interesting aspect, what I remember, and always telling the story, that he explained to me that many of the surgeons who are assistant or associate, they were members of the British Army during the war. And therefore they got medallions, little micro medallions, and they put it on. If you have one, said you can put it on your tuxedo. Started to think and didn't know what they are talking about. Asked me again, do you have a medallion? I said, yes. So what was your medallion? Said the yellow star. It was, took a couple of minutes till he recognized that I had a bad humor.
Wow.
Yeah, but
Quite
became
quite
very
the
good
joke.
friends.
I'm sure his jaw must have dropped when you said that.
Yeah, he had to think a little bit
Yeah.
what this bloody Jew had to tell him. But if I'm using the word bloody, this is how I was brought up in the language over there.
Uh-huh.
Um, and then I made a tutorial in Seattle here. They became in, I gave a couple of papers published. I became invited to Cedars of Lebanon.
Hmm.
And the rest of it.
Hmm. And in Australia, that's or if I'm not mistaken, I read that you did some of your most important work as far as developing new surgeries. I'd love to know if you could talk about, um, and forgive me if I mess up some of the lingo, but I'd love if you would talk about what it took to develop um, your, the advances in laparoscopic surgery and your work with stores. Store, am I saying his name correctly?
Yeah, I by coincidence I was invited, not of this subject, to London, and in London I went around and talked to a couple of guys, and I found out that there's a physicist there who invented the new optical system. Endoscopy is pretty well known to look inside. Endoscopine in Greek means looking inside. But the optical systems were very lousy, very poor image, very poor illumination. And I found that this guy have an ingenious idea. And this is when I asked around, including the Yankees, they were not interested. I was in London, and I found this little German company. And you have to know the story why I selected them. When I talk to Storz, my first question is, before I'm going further to tell you what I did, blah, 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 I have, tell me, did you ever be a member of the Nazi Party? The answer was no. Are you a very uh, critical uh, religious Roman Catholic? Said, no, I'm an atheist. Said, you know, I'm Jewish. And he mentioned that he had a very good Jewish friend that didn't have money to start at the time, only a couple of instruments. And he gave in 1940, 43 or 42, a friend who was Jewish, a couple of instruments. He had now asked them to leave Germany. He went to South, uh, to South Africa and became the biggest distributor. Therefore, I wanted to make sure that the guy is not anti-Semitic.
Mm-hmm.
This is my story. And I worked earlier in Australia on a new miniature video camera because when you're looking through an endoscope with your eye, you have one eye, small image, difficult to see, you know. There's no question when I saw the TV shows that time with this large camera, it's a completely different ball game. If you see something with both eyes, if you see something magnified, if somebody else can see in surgery that they can assist and help. This is the short story that we brought this together and established laparoscopic surgery.
Mm-hmm.
They
And
spread around, and when I moved here, 1970, I introduced it first in general surgery. It came later. Laparoscopy, endoscopy was in, but laparo to work in various areas of the body was introduced in 1986, 87.
mm-hmm.
And I was very active in this area.
Mm-hmm.
So far, the story.
George, what are you working on now?
What I want to, what?
What are you working on now?
Well, I found a book which was published in 1912 by a German surgeon who produced a very unique teaching system. He was the first who recommended we should first teach young surgeons before we allow them to operate. He was the first who introduced to teach surgeons before anesthesia was there how to put the patient to sleep, how to take it on a. Anyhow, he published a book of 450 pages, and I translated it in 60 pages because for me it was very important. People should know this.
Mm.
This is chapter one. He was also a very interesting character. He liked music, and whether you believe or not, in turn of the 19th century, in 1910 or something, he had an artist who stood behind him a year to watch surgery. And the artist in the morning made a black drawing, afternoon he colored it, in the evening he showed it the prof, make changes. They produced color pictures which are identical with 3D today.
Hmm. Hmm.
Magnificent. I never saw anything like, and nobody mentioned it. Therefore, I have here a tag. And what happened, we uh, made copies and made a translation of this book,
Hmm.
right? And
That's the translation you're working on?
I finished, but needs a lot of corrections. And the interesting aspect is here where the politics comes in, that we introduced a new surgical procedure 33 years ago.
Mhm.
And not everybody could be trained from 1 month to another. The interesting aspect is something new comes out, and you have a new treatment modality where the patient feels less pain, patient can go home earlier to work, the patient can go return to the work faster. The patient became a demanding patient. He will ask the surgeon, "Are you doing this procedure lapar? What? Lapar? Yeah, I
Hmm.
don't. I went
Hmm.
to somewhere else." Therefore, the patient demand pushed the surgeon to learn it. Of course, not everybody could go to a course, the societies helped. To cut the story short, today, after 33 years, we found out that we need improvement. We need improvement uh, by better treatment modalities. This is the second part of the book,
Mhm.
where we draw attention with a couple of contributors that we have to re-educate the young surgeons for this procedure that we achieve better results. And now is the end word of the whole system. You don't have to be a prophet to predict that we will have this catastrophic virus situation, that our ecology will change.
Mm. Mhm.
Will change. In
Mhm.
other words, we will have less money for health service.
Mm.
Therefore, we have to start to think how we can do it a little bit more economically better results and perhaps with less investment.
Mm.
I mean, you notice in your area that there's not a great prediction to know if our uh, labor market is different.
Mhm. Mhm.
Therefore, um, to cut the story short,
Mhm.
I gave you in my restricted vocabulary some idea what I'm thinking, what I'm doing, and I'm very happy to be member, and I'm very thankful that you asked me because today in my timeline the most important is to have certain contact with people, to have an intellectual
Mhm.
exchange.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, George, for your time and for sharing your story. I know you shared it a lot, but we really treasure it, and it was a pleasure to hear it. It was a pleasure to speak with you and to see you in real time. So
Yeah,
yeah. So George, thank you for being our Ushpiz, our guest tonight,
you are most welcome.
and Moadim l'simcha, Chag Sameach,
Right? Later out.
lehitraot. Okay, bye, George. Thank you.
I know a couple of words, therefore I wanted to show off.
That was very